And now, from beyond our dimension, this is the Jeff Mara Podcast. Here's Jeff.
My guest is Randa Akia, who during her near-death experience interacted with plasma beings on the other side. Randa, thank you for joining me and welcome.
Thank you, Jeff. I'm glad to be here.
Well, we're glad that you're here as well. Randa, if you don't mind, let's start with a little bit of backstory leading up to your NDE.
Something I just wanted to mention, I come from a background in metaphysics, was professional for years. I have this naturally in my background. So I've experienced a lot of different types of consciousness and experiences with different levels of consciousness, I guess you could say, before I had this level of experience with the near death. I personally, physically had something going on. It was actually for a couple of years, and I went to a number of specialists to try and find out what it was. I would have this explosion of energy from my chest, and then I would, I would start to collapse. And so I would manage to catch my body and sit down. There were certain consciousness techniques that I would use to help maintain my control over my body. And I would breathe into it and let it dissipate. And so this had been happening for some time. Well, this particular morning, I had just spoken with my partner at the time, and just the night before, and he had said, well, when that happens, you don't mention that to me. And I said, well, it really hasn't happened when you're here, but if it does, I'll let you know. And so the next morning I was preparing breakfast, and he happened to come home a couple of hours early, which turned out to be fortuitous. He was doing his own death vigil with a friend, staying with him through the night. And he had managed to come home a couple hours early, as I said. And all of a sudden I had these sensations that I would have that usually I'm able to deal with. And since he was home, I decided to mention it to him. And as I turned around to talk to him, basically the lights went out and I collapsed. And it took me a while to come back to myself. There's a whole story with that, to where he said I did manage to make it to the other side of the aisle, and then I turned and fell just like a tree into the wall, blew out the corner of the wall, scared him to death, and just whomped on the floor. And for me, my lights just went out. I just winked out as I turned around to talk to him. And then it was like this buzzing sound above me, and it was annoying. And it was this disembodied head that wouldn't leave me alone until I finally came back enough into my body that I was in excruciating pain. And this head kept saying, should I call 911? Should I call 911? And I'm like, I don't care. What does that have to do with me? I'm thinking I was totally disassociated. And so he finally came around, and I got back enough to where I could feel my body. And he said, look what you did to the wall. He was totally freaking out. So I went to move, and it was excruciating pain. And then I remembered, oh, crap, you don't move people who are injured. But, I wasn't being sensible and hadn't realized that I'd fallen or injured myself. And so once I saw what I did to the wall, I said, yes, call 911, because I have to take blood thinners. So then the adventure kind of starts from there. I was taken off to the first available hospital. My heart was being, I always had an irregular heartbeat, but this was being extremely erratic. And so they said, no, we have to send you to another hospital. So they put me in another ambulance, sent me to another hospital about a half hour away. And I would come in and out of that just losing consciousness, it seemed. And then when I got to the second hospital, they did all kinds of tests on me, trying to find out what might have happened, what had caused it. Had I had a heart attack? No. Had I had a stroke? No. They didn't know what it was. And so as they were looking at tests, they decided, again, because my heart was so irregular, and it had gotten to where it would skip like 3 beats, which is a long time for your heart to skip. So they decided, okay, we're going to keep you overnight in observation and see if we can tell anything. And so this happened early in the morning, like 7 or 7:30 when it all started. And then it was sometime well afternoon when they got me upstairs into the critical care. And I was just upstairs watching TV at the time. And I was there, and then I wasn't. I just winked out. And all of a sudden, I was in this fabulous, glorious energy field of colors and light, and it was intelligence. And it's very hard to explain because it was so active and alive and multidimensional, and a lot of it was around me. Some of it was directed towards me. I just was overwhelmed with all of these sensations and trying to interpret them. I'm trying to think of an analogy in the world that you could comprehend, but I'm really not coming up with a good one of how impacted you are by everything. But going back to the energy and I was hearing music, and it was so symphonic, and it was like being in surround sound. And for me, a person of my age, we grew up when they just had kind of tinny music. It didn't really have the depth that we have now. And so when in the place that I was in, it was as though it was alive and speaking to you. But it was very hard to tell if it was, I was listening and going, well, is that someone singing? Is it a choir? Is it an orchestra? Is it all of them? Because as I tried to be with it and sense into it and was questioning towards that like a voice, it became more like a voice or the choir or the orchestra. And it was music, but it was so refined and exquisite, and it's almost like it made your body vibrate and be an instrument with it also. And that went on for quite a long time. My experience was highly sensory, highly energetic. That's the type of thing I deal with in my metaphysics and the things I call soundings that I do, is that I receive energy and I interpret that into symbology and language. And that's what I was being impressed with. And as I was, have you ever been in a river and you've been out on a floaty, and you're on this floaty and you're in the river, and so you're having all these different sensations of movement and flow and energy and the sun and the wind, and music was like that, and it was actually a communication of a sort, um, and it felt like it was trying to escalate me and to what is the word? Not accelerate. It's hard to explain, but you are concentrated, but it's almost like becoming a mist to where you're just thousands of everything, but you're all of one. And in that, um, I was feeling like I was being um, expanded and expanded, and I kept feeling I had a sense of a form of myself, something like a teardrop energy form, and I'd had no thoughts of a body, of being human, nothing at all. I was totally consciousness and aware of other types of consciousness. and in my form that I had this feeling that energy was trying to move up through me, like in body, we think of chakras and the energy trying to move up through your chakras. It was something like that. And I kept feeling like I was becoming more and more expanded, like a balloon, just being pumped and pumped and pumped and bigger and bigger. And the feeling that I was having was so tremendous and beyond anything. Nothing I had been involved with was ever like this. And it finally exploded up through me, just gushed like a geyser. And it was all this light. It was this light. It's like magnesium flares, if you've ever seen them, how white and pure and dazzling and sparkling they are, and all this gold, and all of it was consciousness. It was so consuming in what it did, but it broke me open with this geysering, and I just continued to flow and to expand and become more and more of what was. And I was trying to develop some kind of a, I guess you could say, a relationship, trying to understand all these things that I was being impressed with, that I would have knowing of. And I got to where I started asking some questions internally. And finally, because this was just, it was so exquisite, this feeling, but I never had anything that came close to it. And so I finally asked, I said, "What is this?" And it was this glorious just explosion. It was like a huge choir of angels, or the Mormon Tabernacle Choir, and it just went joy, 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 and just exploded like the grandest fireworks. And it's all gushing through you and of you, and you're all of it, even though I was just this little, myself was just this little spark within all this grandeur of light and color. And as I become more one with the flows, I was trying to just sense and be with it and receive. I realized that I was of this, truly a part of this essence, that I couldn't be separate from it. Nothing could be separate from it and of it and as it. And that was the creative God source. And that it's a consciousness, it's a living, sentient consciousness, not a deity. And I'm just an aspect of that. I had I had a lot of questions for myself also. I had, probably the best way to say it, it was like overlapping things. If you had different movies going at the same time and some of them would overlap on top of each other, and having to choose which one you focused on, there was a group of beings that were sort of half formed that I was aware that was there. And I had this sense of a presence. I felt like an energy presence that was wanting to be in specific contact with me off to my left. And I looked off to the left, and that was the first time that I really saw a being that, if you've ever seen in movies or on TV, a plasma flow, it's just this charging funnel of this intense, concentrated white light, just more than a beam or a laser, and it's alive. It has sentience and consciousness, and that was off to my left. And as I actually looked at it, it sort of softened, and I recognized it. I knew that being, I knew its essence, and that I had loved it. I had cherished that being for eons of time. So it was our essence level, which is even beyond our soul. And it knew me on that level also. And it was so enveloping isn't even the right word. You're of it, and it's of you. And I knew there was more that to this particular entity showing themselves to me, but it didn't have the form. It just had all the energy and light, the colors, but it still was sending like sensations to me. And so I kind of started getting feelings of like texture, or it wasn't quite a taste. It's like there's something on the wind. You're smelling a fragrance from a flower or something. Well, so for me, then it was like Chanel number 5. And that sort of clicked with a part of myself, Chanel number 5. And so that reminded me of my mom. That was her favorite fragrance. And she was kind of a sturdy woman, very powerful, but she could be very, very soft. And when she chose to love you and envelop you, she was very tender and kind of marshmallowy. And for special occasions, she wore this scent, Chanel number 5. And once those pieces, it was sort of like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle, came together, that was communicating my love relationship with my mom. When I looked at this being, it took on that form. And she said to me, I am so glad to be with you again. And just maintaining herself, but even so encompassing me again in that marshmallowy energy that was her. And then there were others that were just, it's like being wrapped up in a swirling rainbow at the sunset, how the colors were. And I knew that they had consciousness, that they had sentience, that was a level of being that someone existed in, and they were trying to communicate with me. And I just was so sensory in that, that I kept like tasting it is the best way to explain it. And there's something else that happened that I feel like I'm forgetting that was important. So much happened, and so it's so hard to remember it all. And it actually took me a long, long time for a lot of this to be able to interpret it and to find words to be able to share it with people, because it was so sensory and energetic based in the communication of it. I realized finally, because these things had started communicating with me on all different levels at once, that I was in communication and in a type of relationship with it. And then this hand came out and presented itself, and there was a card deck on it, which you could think of it something like a large tarot deck. And if you've seen the Harry Potter movies, in the Harry Potter movies, on the stairwells on the first movie, they just had picture frames of all these old witches and wizards. And then in the second one, those that were in the picture frame started interacting with each other. And in the third movie, then they not only interacted with each other, they could go into each other's pictures. And then they started interacting with the kids out in this whole different dimensional reality. And that's kind of like what happened with these cards, is that when I looked into them at first, it just looked like a flat card. And then it became like a movie. But I was in that movie. I recognized who I was in that life and what I was meant to see. And it wasn't thoughts. I actually became and lived as that, and not just in memory form, but the others that were primaries that showed up in this card of another lifetime. I also, to experience how I had affected them. They were people that I'd had primary effect on. And so it could have been something that harmed them, whether it was intentional or not, how I had benefited them and gifted them in some way, whether, again, that was intentional or not. These were things that I went in and experienced as them. And I had their full history, their full life, all of their psychology and their memories of me and that interaction in that life and what it meant to them. And so I was in a true state of knowing. There was no separation, and I knew all that they knew and that they experienced. And in other happenings more generally after that, I found that to be true. The level of consciousness that I was in, a lie could not be held. Everything was seen, everything was known, because in reality, you're one with everything. You have this connectedness, and even though you might be a little cell in a body, you're all connected and in communication and have access to each other. And so a lie could not be held. Then because of, uh, I did see some other people then that were, one was of my childhood. It was my nephew. And I was really kind of surprised because this was my aunt's youngest child, and she absolutely adored this baby. It was her last child, and he was struck and killed at 2 years old by a car. And I barely knew him, but he was one of those children that you just instantly love. He's just a loving presence. And when I recognized him in this experience, he looked more like a teenager, and he impressed to me, please tell my mom I'm okay. I was fine. I didn't suffer. I'm fine. And I did share that when I came back. And I still didn't have any real sense of my own self having a body or not being in my body or any kind of death thoughts, nothing. I just was pure consciousness, and everything that I interacted with was consciousness. And then I realized that, okay, this isn't like any other level of consciousness I've experienced. And I have done tremendous things in consciousness. I was raised to have the ability to control pain, to control my autonomic nervous system, to control my brain waves. And this was all documented. Controlling pain, having instantaneous healing. One of the things that my dad did, he did hypnosis. I was his primary subject for the people that he was trying to teach. And he would use these big darning needles, and I would be hypnotized. And he would put them through my wrists and through my hands, and he had to use pliers, which really freaked people out, to pull them out. But there would be no bleeding. I was a little kid, like 7 years old, sitting there while he's doing this, my cheek, my lip, my ears, and there would be no hole, no blood, no pain response from me. So that's just one example of having experiences in consciousness. So I recognized that this, where I was all consciousness, and I had never been there before by far, ever. And so then that caused me to recognize that I was at a prime opportunity, and I had some questions. And so something that I had worked with all of my life is that I had seen how imbalanced our society was. And my dad, for being as talented and as aware and as seeking as he was, he had a terrible temper. And so I really saw, and my mom would be passive and he would be aggressive. And so I really saw that pattern in our family. And I realized as a kid at 11 that if I didn't want to become that, I had to figure out how to do and be something different. So I had studied passive aggressive behavior and trying to figure out how to be assertive the majority of my life. So this was an opportunity for me to ask for more clarity about that. And so I was taken back, actually clear back to the inception of when we, as what we think of as spirit, but it's more essence, decided to have an experience in matter. And a lot of things complicated that, to where initially we would come and it would be like a playground. It'd kind of be like going and playing in a pool and getting in the water and getting it all over you and seeing what you could do with it and how you could play with it and what you could make out of it. And then you'd go home. Well, matter's kind of sticky stuff. And people got really enthralled with it. And there were other influences that came into play that I don't know, a lot of people would have a hard time with this, but that other alien species came in and that had more experience in matter and in the different dimensions of matter that we live in. There's different levels of consciousness, third and fourth and fifth dimensions people are more aware of now. And so they have more skills at manipulating these things. They understand the principles and how to apply them and utilize them. And so that affected us as a species. And we made some agreements that we weren't really fully aware of that caused us to slip into duality kind of thinking, oppositional thinking, and being of the mind rather than of our heart, which has to do with our soul, and following what we know to be so. And so it's like matter stuck to us, and we couldn't just leave the body as readily as we had in the past and put it aside like a suit and put it back on. And so we started actually having lifetimes that we spent in form. And something that I was shown that I was impressed with out of all of that is that right now we passed a point. People have tended to feel like, well, we're right there on the brink or whatever. No, we're past the brink of this shift in consciousness, and we're moving out of duality, out of opposition. But people are just really starting to become aware of it and to see the effects of it, all the conflict and all the harm that it causes and the mentality that creates that, and how our systems are built upon those thought forms. And so how for the most part we're seeing the evidence of it. We're taking it as very present tense, where actually it's in past tense. For the most part, we have moved through that, and we're right there at that final tipping point by not reinvesting anything more into it. That don't fight against it, don't try and fix it, step out of that whole thought form and step into creating equitable interactions, each one of us right where we are, and it all snowballs and adds up. And this is happening globally. And so the old systems that aren't functional, that are based on this opposition, this dualism, that somebody has to lose and somebody has to win, the more we start participating, like we've seen in the Olympics, all of these athletes helping each other to do better. Like one of the women's running teams saw that one of the African, I think it was the Israeli team, saw that one of the African teams had old terrible shoes, and they didn't have the spikes on it, so they couldn't get the traction that the other teams could have, and so they bought them shoes so they could compete on equal ground. These things are happening everywhere, and that's what's changing our world. That we've already moved into that. We're seeing it everywhere. It's just really important that that is what we focus on. That is what we share. That is what we choose, because that we first have to create imaginally with thoughts, and then the emotion. And the more that we hold the emotion, we clarify the thoughts, we get the notion of what we really want, and we start sensing and feeling just exactly how we want it to come to us and what we want it to be. We start forming that out of the ethers. We start attracting that particle by particle until we attract it into form, and we start working with it in form. And right now, with the energies that are happening, all the things that's happening from our sun and from the central sun, we are changing from, we've been carbon-based units. They use that term on Star Trek. I don't know if you watch Star Trek. I really like that program.
Yeah, I do.
There's carbon-based units of matter. And now what's happening, and part of what the sun is doing with all of these different rays and frequencies, that it's just permeating us like crazy. The planet, everything on it, is we're elevating as a species, as humans, to a crystalline structure. So we're becoming less dense, actually physically, as far as matter, and less dense in our energy, which has a weight and a frequency level that is much slower and could be thought more animalistic because it's more attached to the material world. And we're elevating up into what we consider the more spiritual, and coming into the recognition that we are divine. So we're moving into Homo sapien divine, recognizing that everything is of source, God, whatever term that you want to use, that is this higher power that is intelligence and creative, and that we can be in relationship with, that we can listen to and receive guidance, knowing, and knowing there's a quality to it that you just know that it is so, that it doesn't come from thought, it doesn't come from logic. It's that you just know that that is what is so for you at this time. And if you follow that, it will play itself out. It will prove itself to be. And a lot of people, I'm trying to think of the word. Well, maybe the word will come to me, but basically it's that it's like a serendipitous happening that keeps happening, and it just builds on itself, and you just find your way through without having to plan without having to do all the constructive thoughts that we were always taught we needed to do logically and rationally and linearly. We're letting go of time also. And so our linear framework is breaking down. And the more that we can allow ourselves to be present with ourselves, like being in meditation and just emptying ourselves, breathing techniques are really good because they put you in touch with a sensory experience that then draws other sensory experiences to you. And that's my whole near-death experience was like that. It was all these sensory experiences that then created awareness and knowing and sharing and relationship. And the feeling, as I mentioned earlier, that I am a spark in this wholeness of light. And it's all of these sparks, all of these aspects of and as God expressing itself through us and creating more and more and more. And so for me, one of the things that really hit home is that we're at a point of unlearning duality. And that's kind of I don't know, I guess you could say my new mantra. And I was shown that karma is not what is commonly thought. So many human concepts are anchored in this dualistic oppositional thinking. And I asked them to please help me understand where this comes from, what is the core that this springs from, because there's so many things that are anchored to that dualistic, judgmental, good, bad context that we have, especially in religion. And so part of what happened is that I, with these colors that were so phenomenal, they were like gemstone tones with light shining through them, or some of the pictures that you will see of the sun that's just bursting over the horizon in the morning, or the sunset, and the colors that are shown. It's like that, but 1,000 times more. Very, very jewel tone. People who are artists, they deal with acrylic paints, and they're very intense and they're very vibrant, and it has a certain concentration, but then again, it's so filled with light. It was that type of a thing. And these lights, they started communicating with me. They were levels of frequency, which are like levels of consciousness. And within each one of those levels, there's a spectrum of knowing. There's certain talents and skills that come with it. And part of it is choice of wanting to be within that spectrum. And also part of it can go with elevation, because the frequencies will refine themselves and become quicker and faster. And those are the ones, the faster that we resonate, that we vibrate, and that we harmonize, the more truly in sync with the higher realms, with what we tend to label God and source, the greater our contact with those types of beings. Or with the energy beings, the plasma beings, for all of their force isn't the right word, And intensity isn't quite the right word, but it's like intentional movement, holding their basic form and color. It has a mastery to it that it's not just something that happens. There's skills and learning involved with it. And they were impressing on me and many at the same time. And I was aware that this was happening, and I just went, okay, I'm receiving this. It was made known to me that I would have these things and that they would make themselves clearer with time, because it was just so much, and so much that was beyond me, that I was still doing my best to form ways to relate with experience at that level. And since that time, one of the things that has been shown to me that I was led to is the caste system, and that is the core, the caste system. And the caste system was brought in through other beings, through us as a new species, and naive in our physical being, agreed to certain things. And actually, it was upside down thinking. And duality is actually an upside down thinking. You can be convinced logically of something, and we're seeing that happen now very dramatically. A person can convince people emotionally, get them hooked emotionally in agreement of things that are presented that actually can be very factual, and that you can see that, yes, those are non-functional things. Yes, I agree, those need to be changed. And so get that person hooked in there emotionally, but then how they rationally deal with it and utilize it for their own purposes is totally different. It's for their own purposes.
Are you saying that humanity lives within a caste system of other beings in other realms? And if so, is this all set up by the ETs?
We have been affected by other ETs, good and bad. And that there was a point in our early history where influenced by one species in particular, kept us within this realm of influence that made it very difficult for us to move beyond that level of frequency. And so in a sense, they bound us for their own purposes. But there are others, many, many others, who have been in support of us, are in support of us now. And that particular frequency veil, we have been helped enough by the others through our own development that has now been shattered. That's a whole new potential that we haven't fully had before, that we do now. We don't have that. You could think of it as like the glass ceiling. We don't have that anymore, but we're so used to that, and we've been so ingrained in it, in our history, in what we've inherited as far as our thinking and our belief systems, that we're still very penetrated by it. And so most people only really see the caste system and its influence in India. And that's the easiest way to really get the feel of it, because they have the elite that live like kings. And then they have all these different levels that they're doing their best to move out of, and supposedly they've been freed from, but they, still the consciousness has to shift and has to move down through all the different levels. And of course, the higher ones don't want the lower ones to shift out of it because they serve them. They create their life for them to have. And so those at the very bottom in India are the untouchables. And those people, and you're born into these levels of worthiness. It's not like here where you at least can move out of them through education or finance or whatever. They're born into it. And people who are the untouchables have to perform the foulest things. They have to clean the sewers of the waste by hand with their bodies in it. So foul of things. So I really recommend this is the unlearning duality and being able to see this caste system, because once you recognize it, you can see it in our society everywhere. We live in a caste system.
Do you remember what those ETs looked like?
No. Other than the ones in particular that were helping us elevate, were very, very tall, large, a golden, very gentle of spirit. The others that were way, way, way back that started this whole thing, no, I wasn't involved with those. I was just made aware that impact on us was one of the very first times that we as a species consciously chose, and that was through misperception. That we were inspired by the emotions that we saw and the reality and the truth that we saw, that they agreed through that level of their being, their emotional self. And then they couldn't really keep up with the other logic stuff that these supposed, more intelligent people who could organize and structure things and would handle all that, how they twisted around to their own purposes. And we actually enslaved ourselves. And we're now starting to free ourselves from that.
Wow.
Each one of us, one by one.
How did you come back from your NDE back to your body?
I just winked back in. I never even realized that I was out of body. I hadn't realized that I had passed. I didn't know. I'd been laying there flatlined. When I came back, I had all these people over me. And I didn't really fully realize it until I went to sleep that night, because there was a kind of a fuss about me. And then I had this one doctor came in who was an assistant to my cardiologist, and she kind of read me the riot act and asked me, well, are you ready for a pacemaker now? And I was like, well, okay. I mean, it wasn't like I knew I even needed one, okay, sure. And so a lot of that was checking me out and organizing things and deciding I needed to have a pacemaker as soon as possible. And I had atrial fib extremely bad. And so they had to put me on this medication. I had to stay in the hospital because it was so dangerous to take this stuff to try and get my heart regulated. And and I had a lot of different things where I almost passed again 4 different times after, because I went home and I thought that they gave me a pacemaker, right? It's going to pace your heart. But especially with that one doctor that chewed me out, I thought I'd be fine. And my partner was going to China for a month, so I didn't want to be home alone with a heart that was just going to stop. Well, so then, this is just a funny aside for me. I got up in the morning, went in to go to the bathroom, came out of the bathroom, and the next thing I knew, I was waking up on my bed. Like, what the heck happened? And that happened another time before I went, I'm passing out by myself here. So I
Yeah.
called and said, hey, I'm still doing the same thing. This pacemaker's not working. And the nurse says, well, it hasn't been programmed yet. I was like, what? My heart, I have a really unusual things going on with my heart. One of the things that they deciphered is that there's 5 different segments to your heart, and there's an upper portion and a lower portion. And there is it's like a sympathetic nerve connection between your upper heart and your lower heart that connects the pump, the beat of each one in rhythm. I don't have that. I don't have any kind of linkage. So that made things really kind of difficult to try and figure out how to place the pacemaker and then how to program it.
Randa, after watching this podcast, people may want to reach out to you and ask you questions. Are you open to that?
Sure.
What's the best way to contact you?
Probably through my email.
All right. Do you want to give out your address?
Sure. It's Akeia, AKEIA .Randa, RANDA @gmail.com.
Do you have anything that you're working on or doing that you want people to know about?
Well, for me, being able to share what I've learned about duality and how we can step out of it, that I am working to put together information for people, because you can just step out of it. You don't try and fix it. It doesn't work. Then you're just more encompassed by it. And looking into the caste system, and especially looking at India, and then looking at ourselves, it will help people see how we are highly invested in that. And again, it can help us see how to start stepping out of it. And that's the most critical thing right now, is stopping the behavior, stepping out of it, becoming neutral to it. And then once you get that down, you can start learning how to apply yourself more equitably and more equationally, so that what you start with, what your intention is, that's what your result is going to be. So those are my interests. That's what I'm doing now. I am doing my soundings with numerology, which is your soul gives you your full name at your birth and your birth date, and that tells me who you are, what you have decided to give yourself as skills, as cycles, timing in your life. I can read your psychology influences that you're under, help people learn how to interpret things for themselves, so then they can become their own best oracle.
Randa, thank you for sharing with us today. We appreciate you, and I wish you the best.
Thank you so much, Jeff. I appreciate the opportunity to come and share with you, and I like the questions that you ask. That's always helpful too.
Thank you. Thanks for watching the Jeff Mara podcast. I really appreciate you. Another way to show support is through YouTube memberships. And if you do, there are loyalty badges and other perks depending on your level of membership. All you need to do is click the join button underneath the video to find out more. Thank you for your support.